Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 41st episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about racism and genuine allyship. This week's episode was actually meant to be about my new online course, The Mentally Healthy Professional. However, with what's been happening this week, and quite frankly for the past 400 plus years, I felt the need to speak about my own experience of racism, the faces of racism, and why we all need to and can take action for Black communities and really show that Black lives matter. And it's great that if you've done Blackout Tuesday and you've been on protest, that is brilliant. But we all have to continue to push for systems to shift in order for there to be genuine change. And I really want to state that this isn't me jumping on the bandwagon either. If you're a regular listener, I talk about race and have guests from a variety of professional backgrounds to talk about race, culture and equality. Race is something I have decided to and I always talk about a lot and a key thread of my work. This is probably going to be a podcast where I'm going to talk most about my own lived and personal experience. And I would say that racism has been a thread running throughout my whole life since I was a child. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that my experience parallels the brutality that the Black community have faced and are facing and continue to face. But I wanted to share a little bit about my context. So if you're listening, you can understand why I'm so passionate about racism, what it means to me, and why I think it's vital that brown people stand up for Black lives and Black empowerment. Something I don't talk about very much is that I was born in the US. So I was actually born in Dallas, in Texas, and I'm hoping that you probably wouldn't guess that from my accent. But interestingly, when I meet Americans, sometimes they can actually tell that I wasn't born in Britain. So there's clearly something there. And when I was born in the US in 1982, Asians had a very different status and identity to now. There wasn't as much anti-Muslim sentiment as there is now. And because depending on the state that you're born in and how they classify race, the question on my birth certificate actually says, is the mother or the child of Hispanic origin or Black origin? And if the answer is no, you are classified as white. So in fact, on my birth certificate, I am technically white, which I find really strange and difficult and weird. And I'm using the term Hispanic as it was in the 1980s. I know that now the term is Latinx or Latinx. There was no discussion or space really around this. I did go to a school that was quite multicultural. It was quite a wealthy school and there were people from all over the world, particularly that worked in the oil industry. But I can't say that people really spoke about race. And in particular, the school that I went to, we didn't have a day off for Martin Luther King Day, which is a bank holiday, which when I look back is absolutely, totally and utterly disgusting. I moved to the UK in 1990 and I do remember the incident very vividly, watching on the news about Rodney King, who was brutally beaten by police in LA and didn't die at the time. What the brutality and the intense, unjust beatings that he received did cause him long-standing and life-changing disabilities. One of the other things is isolation is a theme for me. So I went to secondary school in Kent. In fact, I did one of my last years in a primary school in Kent, and then I went on to a secondary school in Kent. And Kent in the 90s is not where you want to be as a person of colour. And I don't particularly think it is now, if I'm honest. And I never go back because of the memories that I have. I loved school, and I'm lucky that I was an academic person, and it could have been far, far worse. But for me, the thread was isolation. I felt very isolated. I didn't fit in culturally. My family wanted to hold on to important Asian values, and rightly so, but there was kind of nowhere to go with that. We were quite isolated as a family. We didn't live near our wider family. There wasn't much communication. There certainly wasn't support from our wider family. So as a result, I think I found solace in music, and I talk about this quite a lot. And I used to listen to Skank Anansi, Mary J. Blige, Erykah Badu to have those connections. And Erykah Badu is a fellow Texan. So for me, that was the way that I found connection, because there were a handful of girls of colour in my school. In my year, I could probably count them on one hand. I think maximum it was 5. And I think that experience of isolation is really what's driven me to do what I do now, and also to get involved in race equality work. And one of my big heartthrobs was Jazz Man, who actually I found on Twitter recently. Some of you may know from that infamous Levi's advert, Spaceman, the song by Babylon Zoo. So I had posters of him on my wall because I felt like he was the only, Asian man that was in the public eye. And it feels cringy saying that, but I think it's just important to share that how this happens. And I would read articles about him and everyone would find it really strange. But that was one of the very few bits of obvious public life connection you see, for Asian men of color, Asian men, because they don't really exist much now, but at least there's a bit more of a choice. But yeah, that's interesting. And I remember I used to I love Sinead O'Connor. So I listened to Sinead O'Connor today, in fact, and she has a song called Black Boys on Mopeds. And the chorus is all about England is not the land of Madame George and her roses. It's a country where policemen kill black boys on mopeds. And that's not to say that I think all police are terrible. And that's not to say that I've worked with some brilliant police officers, my time at university on for women's cases and supporting international students. But I think it's very powerful when someone like Sinead O'Connor sings that. And I listened to it again today and it reminded me of growing up, but it reminded me that sometimes things shift, but do they fundamentally change? And I was fortunate enough to be able to leave Kent at the age of 15 and go on to sixth form at Cambridge. And I met some amazing people there, friends that I'm still very good friends with. You might know the poet Angry Sam. So he was one of my sixth form friends, and a group of wonderful women that I'm still friends with now. And then I went on to the University of Leeds, which 90%, 95% was amazing. But I did food sciences and there was a competition. I think it was run by a particular corporate company. I can't remember the exact details, to write about flavourings. And I think you got a prize or there was some money involved. And I really wanted to do this. And I remember talking to my head of department and he asked me what my favourite food was. And I said, I don't know, sort of offhand, strawberry ice cream. He went, no, think again. What about curry? Why don't you write about curry? Because I think that will be far better for you. And I remember being absolutely stunned. And if that had been me now, I would have gone and complained about him. But see, you might think, well, that's just a flippant remark, but that degrading, that's a really classic example of microaggressions. So I've worked in the area of race equality for over 15 years, and I was lucky to start my career as an elected sabbatical officer at Leeds University Union from 2003 to 2004, where I set up a Black and Asian Students Forum and did work on student race. It was very light touch in some ways, I suppose, compared to what's going on now, but I feel really privileged to do that, and it's where we started conversations talking about race and culture. Following that, I then worked in Barcelona for 6 months in an immigrant support scheme. It was a volunteering project called European Voluntary Scheme. And it was really tough because I saw the way that migrants were treated. I saw the way the Moroccan community were treated, who were deeply respectful towards me. And I also experienced the worst sexual harassment I've ever experienced in my life by new arrivals from Pakistan. Now, I'm not saying that this is blanket, that this will happen to everyone, but that was my personal experience. So being stared at, I'd never experienced it in the UK. And interestingly, my personal journey is that having dark hair and dark skin in England means you're invisible. So I never had any unwanted attention. And again, I'm very aware that that's my experience. That is not every Asian woman's experience by a long stretch. But in Barcelona, that was all flipped on its head. And I found that really difficult. But while I was there, I had the privilege of seeing the great Angela Davis speak about women, race and prisons. And that's one thing I have been so, so grateful for, being able to see amazing speakers. I think having links to universities, this has always had something that I've had access to, and it has helped my own personal education. As I mentioned, just because I'm Asian, that does not mean I understand the Black experience and the Black experience of police brutality, being asked about if someone can touch your hair, the different negative sexualization of Black women versus Asian women. But I have always tried to educate myself and understand what it's like from all the different perspectives from global majority cultures. So I was there for 6 months, and interestingly, it was the only time in my life where I had ever felt super, super British. So as I said, I was born in the States and then I moved here, and I certainly don't feel English, and I never really felt British until I went away for 6 months to do that work. I came back and I then got a job at the University of Oxford working in something called the Oxford Access Scheme, which was all about encouraging young, mainly Black and Asian young pupils from inner city backgrounds to think about Oxford and to think about higher education. And I met and worked with some phenomenal Oxford students from those backgrounds who would be the mentors and who would do the talks and who would be the role models for the students coming up. Now, for those of you who've listened to my podcast episode on bullying, you'll know that Oxford was hardly a walk in the park. And sadly, the things that you read in the press are the tip of the iceberg in terms of race equality. After working for the Access Scheme for 3 years, I was then seconded to be the university's first race, religion and belief project officer. But it's not all bad, because I did get to have a special breakfast with Reverend Jesse Jackson. I mean, how lucky is that? I never thought I'd ever meet Reverend Jesse Jackson. So, of course, who was very close to and worked with Martin Luther King. I was also able to, in the new role that I was seconded to, I organised Black History Month. So if you want to know more about how I did that, please do listen to the podcast episode on how to organise events for Black History Month. And I had people like Afua Hirsch be my keynote speaker, and she absolutely blasted it out of the water, of course she did, and talked about her own lived experience of racism at Oxford, just after one of the very senior people at the time had said there's no racism here, which again, this culture of denial and silence is incredibly painful. It's also untrue, but it keeps happening. And I had people like Gus Casely Hayford talk about his programs when he did the history and the civilizations of art in Africa. So it wasn't all bad. And some of the students I worked with, and they probably wouldn't remember me, but were Riz Ahmed. So he did some volunteering for young people from different schools, and Leila Nathu, who's now on the BBC. And also the wonderful Dan Stone, who's just published a book about his life after Oxford. So really privileged, and I wouldn't have met these people otherwise. And someone I just reconnected with recently is Vidya Ramalingan, and she is the CEO of Moonshot CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. So I'm very, very lucky. I'm incredibly privileged, but it was really tough. And again, just this week, there was an article in The Guardian about Oxford and how some students are having to receive training after making jokes, yes, that's right, jokes, about George Floyd and the death at Hustings. So Oxford students get anti-bias training after George Floyd joke at Hustings. And we saw this. I saw events like reparations. It was a cocktail night about reparations, and they had a slave-themed cocktail at one particular college. I had numerous Black students talk to me about being asked by white students whether they sold drugs. This was very commonplace, and of course this is nonsense, because that's absolutely not what they did, and the fact that they were even asked that is ludicrous. I had stories from Black sports people at Oxford, their hands not being shaken by opposition white teams, or opposition teams where some players were white. I also had one student who'd been called an effing derogatory word for Chinese community to her face, and then told that she was the problem. And all these things happened quite regularly. So the things you read in the press, yes, they're the tip of the iceberg. And the things that I saw in my role were exhausting. And I feel like I had an incredible insight into privilege and racism. Not a good insight, not one that I would wish on someone of colour, because it degrades you. It absolutely erodes your inner being, or it did mine. And you reach a place of burnout and exhaustion. So then when I went to Imperial College, where I'm not, which was just 1,000 times better, which was incomparable, where I feel there was a space to talk about race, where people were supportive, where I didn't feel shut down. It was just a huge breath of fresh air. But I thought it was important to just give you a bit of context about my lived experience. And even though I feel like I experience far less racism now, what I do see in the mental health and well-being space is that most of the speakers are from white backgrounds. I would love, and I think it's absolutely vital, that we see more Black speakers talking about mental health. They're absolutely out there, but where are they? I feel that the people that are listened to are still from particular backgrounds, socioeconomic and white backgrounds, and there's a lot of work to be done. So why should you care? Why should we all care about Black Lives Matter and about race equality? And this might sound a bit controversial, but just because we don't, or I don't, or you don't lynch a Black man in public by kneeling on his neck, that still means you have to speak out. And I include myself in that. I don't for a minute think that I understand everything. I have some insight, but I too have to learn and challenge myself. This includes challenging the community, the South Asian community that I'm part of, where there is colorism and shadism, where lighter skins are chosen over darker skins, where lighter skins in the Asian community are seen to be more beautiful, and anti-blackness needs to be understood through the lens of the ongoing colonialism. I think these conversations are really difficult to have. In Renee Edo Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, I feel that if I could write like her, my book might be called Why It's So Difficult to Talk to South Asians About Race. So it's still a very, not taboo really, but a very difficult and uncomfortable subject that many people in the community don't want to talk about, but we need to do it, especially within the different religious groups. And within workplaces, every year we have reports on race equality. So there's the McGregor-Smith report, there's the BITC do a report every year on race equality in the workplace, their race equality scorecards, numerous reports in the UK. Also, Harvard Business Review write a lot about race, or the specific contributors do. The information is there. I have to say, we don't actually need more research. There is collective trauma. I was just speaking to someone now who said, in my life, I've been through so much. I've been through forced marriage. I've been through honour-based violence. I've had community knocking on my door because I wanted to leave the father of my children. However, when I was racially bullied at work, that's when I developed anxiety. This is huge. People not being put forward for jobs they're absolutely capable of. The ethnicity pay gap, then the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap altogether, pension gaps. We still haven't addressed Windrush. And if you want to know more about Windrush, please do listen to the episode that's going to be coming out on the 23rd of June with Patrick Vernon, and that's all about Windrush and what you can do. These things haven't gone away, and they're not going to go away if we remain silent. And I think there's a lot we can all do. I have felt frustrated with people saying, well, what can I do really to change it? What can I do? And I have to say, there is absolutely loads you can do, and you don't have to be silent. And also, if you don't feel safe and you don't feel like you want to go out and protest, understandably, with there still being the COVID virus, there is still a huge amount that you can do. One of the first things that I would suggest we all do is to write to our MPs about the report that was released around the BAME, global majority black deaths in relation to COVID. And however, this report was substandard. There were no recommendations, and there was no concrete ways in which, going forward, how black lives and black healthcare workers' lives were going to be protected and healthcare outcomes improved. So why not write to your MP and ask about that? Or if you don't want to write, tweet them or send them a message. Also, you can write to your Police and Crime Commissioner. In London, this will be through the London Mayor's office, because effectively Sadiq Khan, the current Mayor of London, is the Police and Crime Commissioner. But if you live outside of London, you can find your Police Crime Commissioner and ask them what's being done to prevent black deaths in custody, prison, and how black communities are being engaged with around crime rather than being attacked. You can also write to or tweet your local constabulary or your police and community safety officers. They normally do have a Twitter account. And I mean do this politely, do this in a way that means that there is engagement, but ask about community cohesion, initiatives, and how all communities are being consulted and supported with on everyday crime issues. You might also like to check stop and search figures and ask questions. So stop and search figures are publicly available. And also finding out why the stop and search was carried out. So was it a suspicion of knife crime, drugs? What was the reason? And if you can, get involved in your local neighbourhood action group. They all have slightly different names depending on the council that you're part of. And if you feel able to get involved, that's a really good thing to do. I would also say write to your local councillors, because your councillors will have insights into the local scrutiny committees that will be happening as part of as subcommittees of full council. To ask them questions, go to your local surgery, ask them questions about Black Lives Matter, employment opportunities, what's being done, and how councils are funding specific black projects and initiatives to raise the equality bar. This is really vital. And remember, they work for you. Councillors work for you. We have voted them in. We might not be the person that we voted in. However, under our system, we do have the right to ask questions, and our councillors have a duty to respond. Find out about your local race equality organisation. This could be based in your CAB, so your Citizens Advice Bureau. It might be quite a small operation. It might be that you've got groups happening on Facebook, but support them with your time, with your money, if that's an option, or your skills. So perhaps you're really good at marketing. Could you help them amplify their message? Could you help them do newsletters? Could you help them with their mailing list? Could you help them with copy? Could you help them with a website? Anything at all. Another thing that's really important is to not jump in with our advice and let Black communities grieve and recognise the collective trauma they have experienced, and unfortunately will continue to experience. It really is about listening, and listening some more, and then asking what you can do to help. I recommend checking out the Black, African and Asian Therapy Network, BATIN, as a signposting resource. We'll talk about later this month in the subsequent podcast episodes about how Black and Asian communities will have to and need to grieve differently or have different cultural needs that unfortunately due to COVID-19 haven't always been able to be met. So this is going to cause increased trauma. And then with everything that's happening globally, this is going to add on to that trauma. So be patient, keep checking in on that person, because it is actually difficult to reach out when you feel low. So it is all of our duty to check in with our friends who may be suffering, experiencing loss and trauma. And please do find out more, educate yourself by reading, listening and watching content from Black activists. There's been a lot on social media that I think has been really helpful. And I've also curated a list in the show notes from commentators through the ages and now. Specifically about white privilege, white fragility, and understanding Black voices. Now, it's not everyone from a Black community's job to educate us, but if people have spoken out, we do have a duty to read that and understand. And please don't be afraid to have conversations in your own communities. As I mentioned with my own community, it's difficult, but we have to keep doing it. And what that looks like, it feels uncomfortable. Often the thing with racism is that people think, well, I'm not a racist person. And you might not be. I totally understand that. I hear that. It's actually, in the grand scheme of things, not that many people will stand outside somewhere with placards chanting racist abuse. But how do we change the systems and thinking about how we are advantaged and privileged by certain systems, and how other people may not be advantaged and privileged by those systems, and how we have to change those systems to make it more equitable for everyone, including the language we use. And I have a specific podcast about inclusive language if you want to know more. But we do have a duty to check our own reactions, to understand where our prejudice comes from, to understand where our biases come from. This is absolutely essential. And it's often when we flip things on our head, which is what I talk about in the episode about noughts and crosses, so 5 lessons we can learn from noughts and crosses in the workplace, that we might understand how systems are advantaged towards one group of people than another, that enables us to have light bulb moments. If you also feel that you can attend distant, peaceful protesting, I think it's a really great act of solidarity. And it also, for those of us from Black and Asian backgrounds, it's definitely given me strength to keep going. And quite frankly, as a business, why wouldn't you do this, and not just as a flash in the pan exercise? As I mentioned, I am not doing this just as a one-off. I talk about race constantly and consistently, and you'll see that within my podcasts. But why wouldn't you? With my experience of running BAME leadership programs, is when organisations don't take into account Black staff's needs, they lose them and they lose that talent, and someone else benefits, which is great. But why would you want to do that? And this isn't going to be fixed overnight. It's difficult, it's uncomfortable, it's challenging, but we have to keep doing it. So what I want to leave you with is, please, number one, don't think you can't do anything. There is lots you can do, and you can do it from the comfort and safety of your own home. The second thing is, please don't assume what people need. If you're unsure, ask. Ask how you can be of help, or tell someone when they're ready to talk, you're here to listen. Remember plurality. There is no one experience. There is no one Black experience. There is no one female Black experience. There is no one male Black experience. There is no one trans Black experience. So while there might be commonalities, everyone's lived experience is individual to them. Remember to listen, and listen some more. Fifthly, realise that you will make mistakes. Apologise if you need to, and keep going, and ask for someone to illuminate your blind spots. And you can't unlearn white privilege or privilege in 45 minutes. So please commit time and energy to this individually and as organisations. By all means, start the conversation with a 45-minute webinar. But what other actions are you going to do to ensure that you can start to understand what needs to be done to equalise the playing field genuinely? So if you found this helpful, if you want more information about what your organisation can do, I'm very happy to speak with you, and I'd love it if you could book a 30-minute free call with me. By all means, I'm not the authority on race equality, but I'm really happy to have a conversation to get you started and also to recommend some brilliant people I know working in this field. And in terms of my podcast, the other episodes that link to this episode are around Black mental health, how to engage your staff, organising events for Black History Month. Now, this was recorded prior to COVID, so these are related around face-to-face events, but it might give you some ideas about how to engage with people. Paulette Brooks, CEO and Artistic Director of Serendipity Arts, her episode on her experience for Black History Month, October 2019. The episode Sex, Mental Health and People of Colour that was recorded for Valentine's Day with Dr. Annabelle Shoemimo, who is the founder of Decolonising Contraception. Next week, we've got Men's Health Week with Oris, who talks about Black men's mental health and culture and mental health. And also earlier on during the COVID pandemic, I spoke to Asal Sid Ahmed about public health, coronavirus and race equality. So I really hope this has been a useful episode to you. I've found it quite raw and difficult and painful to record for you. And I've included the list of resources, so please do check that out. Do get in touch if I can help. And remember that Black Lives Matter and it's everyone's responsibility to do something about this. So I hope you'll tune in to the next episode where we'll be talking about men's health with Oris Ikiyomi. And until then, I'll see you. And keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.